Welcome back to Wrong Sports as I continue my journey through wartime college football. The last episode was all about the 1943 college football season, which was probably one of the weirdest seasons of all time because there were dozens of teams that didn't play college football. I mentioned how the SEC only had 4 teams in 1943. A lot of them would come back in 1944. But along with the colleges that left, there were also service teams that were added in, as well as college football players that moved around to different schools, and there were also professional football players who played college football. All that stuff happened in 1943. It also happened in 1942, and it would also happen again this season in 1944. But if you heard my 1943 episode, you heard me talk a bunch about Notre Dame. Well, I'm going to be talking about them again, but I'm also going to be talking more about Army and Navy. That was because they would get a lot of new great additions to their football teams over these next 2 years, one in particular being Army, as those new additions and players who would finally get on the field would create one of the greatest football teams of all time. The year of 1944 was when we would first hear the names of Mr. Inside and Mr. Outside, and they were all over newspapers and magazines to not only help motivate their cadet team, but to help motivate all servicemen fighting overseas. But before I get into the 1944 season and the rise of Army football, make sure as always you are subscribed to the channel below. Please ring that bell so you can get updates on brand new videos that I will be dropping all throughout the rest of the spring. I'm also going to be having some college basketball episodes coming up as well in April and May, so make sure you are subscribed for that. And you can check out my Patreon right now, patreon.com/wrongsports. I do a weekly blog on there. I try to do it at least once a week, but I'm going to try to do it multiple times a week. I also have some exclusive videos up there as well. I have an exclusive list of the best service teams during the World War II years, and I go over them on my Patreon, patreon.com/wrongsports. Link is also in the description below. And finally, please like and share this video and share this channel with other college sports fans. So I gave you a quick overview about what was going on in college football and around the world as we get into the year of 1944. But before we get into that, there were still a lot of changes going on. One big one would happen with the defending national champions, Notre Dame, as they would have most of their starters like Heisman winner Angelo Bertelli and Creighton Miller leave for war. Along with that, their head coach Frank Leahy would enter the Navy and would not be on the sideline this year. So in his place would be one of his top assistants in Ed McKeever, who started going to college at Notre Dame before transferring to Texas Tech. He stayed there for a couple of years and graduated before he latched on with Leahy at Boston College and would follow him to Notre Dame and would help build up Notre Dame's great backfield in the last 2 seasons, which helped their fantastic season in 1943. Due to his ties to not only Notre Dame, but to Frank Leahy, and due to wartime restrictions, it was hard to get an interim coach that wasn't already on the campus, so McKeever was given the job for 1944. But without Angelo Bertelli and Creighton Miller, McKeever would have to rely on Frank Dantzwitz, and guys that didn't get too much playing time in 1943. One would be their top back this year in Bob Kelly. And I'll get back to Notre Dame in a moment, but we have to get to 2 teams that you will be hearing a lot about this year, and one that were Notre Dame's big rivals, that being Navy. They were coming off of an 8-1 season in 1943, their only loss being to Notre Dame. But after this season, they would also lose some people due to wartime duties. That would be their head coach, John Winchell, who would be sent out, and a new coach would be brought in, that being Oscar Hasberg, who was a Navy player in the late 1920s, and then he did his naval duties for about the next decade or so. He would be commanding Navy boats and submarines from 1940 to 1943, and when both of those boats were docked out west, he was put back east on the Navy football team. And this team in 1944 would be pretty stacked because they would be bringing back a lot of players from the previous year. One would be their tackle and eventual consensus All-American in Don Whitmire. Whitmire was on their line the last 2 years, but he would shine this year and get that consensus All-American pick at the end of 1944. They also had guard Ben Chase, who would also get All-American honors at the end of the year. And with that great line, it would help out their top back in Bob Jenkins. Jenkins would turn out to be Navy's leading rusher this year, and he came from Alabama, where he actually lettered in the previous season, but he was picked up by the Naval Academy in spring of 1944 and sent to Annapolis. With this great line and with Bob Jenkins running the ball, plus the fact that they had beaten Army the last 2 years, Navy was favored ahead of Army in preseason stories. Army would be a much different and much better team than the previous year, just not a lot of people knew about it yet until about midway through the season. They would still have Earl Blake coaching, but they would need to get some much needed improvement and speed. These additions were one guy that didn't play much in 1943 due to academic concerns, and two guys that came from Southern schools. I'll get to those new additions in just a second, but I have to mention the assistant coach who helped to get those great players to West Point, his name being Herman Hickman. The reason I am covering him is because he would be the big reason why Glenn Davis came to West Point, and I mentioned him slightly in the 1943 video. But the man Herman Hickman had come to West Point after a playing time that saw him start in college at Tennessee under General Robert Neyland. He would then be an assistant under Neyland and was known for his gregarious personality, as he had helped to recruit and coach at Tennessee and then at NC State. But when the war kicked off, he was picked up by Blake, due to Hickman being able to coach up lines. Blake thought that Hickman could help. Along with that, Hickman was also picked up by Blake because the coach knew that Hickman knew where to find talent. And since Army didn't have too many restrictions, like most others did, he was given free rein to find the best talent in high school and also in college. Army didn't have to worry too much about eligibility concerns because if you played at another school, you could also be eligible to play at West Point, regardless of how many years you played at that previous school. Also, when you played at West Point, your eligibility wouldn't be screwed up either. This would first allow Hickman to go out and find Barney Poole, who was quite the offensive weapon at Ole Miss in 1943, and one of the more underrated talents at Army during this time. In addition, Hickman was able to get Doc Blanchard from North Carolina, but his journey to West Point was a little different than his backfield mate Glenn Davis's trip was. First off, Blanchard was a great high school player in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, and just like Glenn Davis, he really wasn't initially recruited or interested in going to West Point. But after he got an offer from University of North Carolina and their legendary head coach Jim Tatum, he elected to go to UNC first for the 1942 season. Since Blanchard was still a freshman and the rules allowing freshmen to play wasn't enacted until the next year, he would have to sit. And Blanchard thought he'd be able to play in 1943, except for the fact that he would then enlist in the U.S. Army with the hope of getting an Army deferment for a year or two, and then maybe picking up college football eventually after that. Instead, though, Blanchard was sent to New Mexico to work in the chemical warfare unit for 9 months until Doc Blanchard's father would step in. Blanchard's father wasn't a high-ranking official or a politician, and instead he knew someone who probably knew someone who got Blanchard out of New Mexico and into West Point in July of 1944. With the addition of Blanchard and Poole for 1944, as well as more playing time for Glenn Davis, Blake and Army would be set. And I will get into the Army season in just a moment, but I gotta go back into the Big Nine Conference. You heard me talk about them a bunch in 1942 and 1943, and I'm gonna be talking about them a little bit in 1944, but not nearly as much as I did the previous 2 years. That would be because there would be a lot of changes. For one thing, their best team last year, one of the co-champions of this conference, Purdue, who went 9-0 due to having a bunch of V12 Navy recruits, well, they would not be the same team this year. Actually, they would lose all those V12 players, and they even lost their coach as well. So their 9-0 record last year will not carry over into this year. And spoiler alert, pretty much this is going to be all I talk about Purdue in this year's video. So sorry about that. Just wanted to mention it real quick. The co-champion of this conference the previous year would be Michigan. They would be coming back this year, pretty much the same team. They did lose some players, but they would gain a new quarterback and fullback, that being Bob Weiss. He would help them stay in the top of the standings in the conference throughout the rest of this year and in 1945 as well. Finally, Ohio State went through a bunch of changes after the 1943 season as Paul Brown would enter the war and be sent to the Great Lakes Navy. Without him, Ohio State would have to find another coach, and Brown would actually set up his own replacement, as he made his assistant Carol Widows as the new coach. Widows was a Paul Brown guy, as he was an assistant under him in high school and then followed him to Ohio State, so he knew of the team and knew what he needed to do to win. And this would be a big deal since Ohio State had a losing record the previous season, but they did have a lot of younger players play last year. So to make his team a little bit better this year, Widows would bring back a former player in Les Horvath. He had been a reserve halfback on the 1942 team, and he would actually graduate after that season and entered Ohio State University's dental school. In those days, grad students could not play varsity football, but wartime eligibility rules pretty much changed that and made anybody eligible to play. And due to that, Horvath would return to the team and become their starting quarterback for 1944. Horvath was very needed, like I mentioned, since Ohio State was full of freshmen who were not yet drafted to war, or they had some older players like Horvath who had either gone through their tour overseas or had deferments due to education. And speaking of Ohio State, I'm going to start the season with them, as they would destroy their first two opponents behind Horvath, as they would beat Missouri and Iowa by a total combined score of 88-0. Their third game was their first big game in conference play, as Ohio State would play on the road versus Wisconsin. Now, if you know your Ohio State University football history, and if you listened to my 1942 video, I covered this game, well, pretty much the pregame of this game in length, and talked about how Ohio State got sick before the game and lost to Wisconsin to ruin their perfect season. Well, this year Wisconsin was in the same boat as Ohio State, in that they had a bunch of 17-year-old freshmen starting, but they somehow got past Northwestern and Marquette to start the season undefeated and ranked in the first poll. Except in this game versus Ohio State pretty much stopped anything that Wisconsin could do, and Horvath would help to get them in the end zone 3 times to win 20-7. In addition, with Ohio State winning to start, so did their top rival Michigan, as they would win in quite the upset, as they beat Iowa Pre-Flight in their first game 12-7 at home, and Iowa Pre-Flight were still a powerful team. So much so that this was their only loss of the season, and actually Iowa Pre-Flight only lost twice in the last 2 seasons combined. After that big win, Michigan would beat Marquette easily before they came back home to play Indiana. Indiana were a team always hanging in the middle of the Big Nine over the last few seasons. They had a great coach in Bo McMillan, who believed his tough running team could beat anyone. And they did score some big upsets in the last few years, like they beat a ranked Iowa squad in 1940, and then they also beat Minnesota in 1942. But this season, McMillan was without his best running back, MP Piehouse, who was sent overseas, but the team would instead rely on linemen and their captain, John Tanvener. Tanvener was actually drafted in the NFL in April of 1944, but elected to come back and use his last year of eligibility to play at Indiana this year. Along with him running the line, they would also have Robert Hunschemeyer, who led the NCAA in total offense in 1943 and missed the first game of 1944 due to wartime training, but would be back for their second game versus Illinois. And Hunchie, as he was called, only played 18 minutes, but he managed to get Indiana close to a comeback, but eventually they would lose 26-18. So coming into the game versus Michigan, Indiana were 1-1. But with this offense, especially with Hunchie running the ball, it would help Indiana to 197 rushing yards and a stunning 20-0 upset win. Indiana would end up winning their next 3 games in October, only giving up 7 points in those wins, and being 5-1 as they would get ready for a November 4th game versus Ohio State, which I will get to in just a little bit. But speaking of Ohio State, they would have another tough game versus number 6 Great Lakes Navy on October 21st. Even though these service academies were full of older players who had experience, Great Lakes was a little different this year since they were coached by Paul Brown. Brown was commissioned to Great Lakes in late April, and most of the players for Great Lakes weren't finalized until about a month or so before the season began. But Great Lakes still had great talent from Iowa, Minnesota, and Notre Dame, which allowed them to learn on the fly. And they would do it again here, as they would actually win 4 out of their first 5 games and score on average 30 points per game. The only blemish would be a 26-26 tie versus Illinois. and it looked like it would be another tie for Great Lakes as they would play Ohio State, as Great Lakes would score first and Ohio State wouldn't end up scoring until after halftime on a Horvath touchdown. The fourth quarter, though, was when it would be a breakout for Horvath and eventually help Ohio State, as Horvath would score again and then score 2 more touchdowns to give Ohio State the 26-6 win. After that win, Ohio State won their next game over a depleted Minnesota team to be undefeated before their matchup against Indiana at the start of November. But I wanted to quickly go through the Big 9 September and October because I gotta go back to Army, Navy, and Notre Dame. Army, I explained, was a much different team from 1943, and they showed just how good and scary they would be. As in their season opener on September 30th, they would play North Carolina at home. Army would completely romp UNC, as they would win 46-0, which by the end of the season was actually a rather close win for Army. Army then destroyed Brown, Pitt, and the Coast Guard by a combined score of 204-14. The Coast Guard game showed just how scary this Army team was, though, as they scored 11 touchdowns, with Davis scoring once, but Barney Poole being the star here, as he scored once and blocked 2 punts in the game to help them win by over 60 points. The slimmest win would be in their 5th game as they would play Duke, and this game would also take place in New York, except in New York City at the Polo Grounds. And Duke would actually hand it to Army in the first half, and they were actually winning 7-6 at half. But after half, Army stopped anything Duke could do, and then Army would score 3 times, including a Doc Blanchard touchdown, to give them the 27-7 win and continue their winning streak. While Army was having a fantastic start to their season, Navy would have a strange start to their season. They kicked it off with a game versus the North Carolina pre-flight team, who were a very good team in 1942, but didn't get the players in 1943, so they had a losing record. In the 1944 season, they would bring in a new coach, who was also a semi-pro baseball player, as well as a small-time college coach, his name being Glenn Killinger. Along with bringing in him, they would also have a future legendary coach on their staff, who was their line coach in Bear Bryant, who was also a line coach for the Georgia pre-flight team in 1942 before he served in North Africa in 1943. After he received an honorable discharge after a year there, he was sent to North Carolina to help train and coach players at North Carolina pre-flight. One of the players that he and Killinger were very excited about was Frank Aschenbrenner, a great running back from Marquette. And also, they would receive Otto Graham, the great quarterback from Northwestern. Graham's career at Northwestern ended in February of 1944, and he was recruited by the Navy as part of their V5 cadet program and sent to Colgate in New York. When Graham went to Colgate, he assumed his football days were over since Colgate were not fielding a football team, and he would play basketball for the school for a little bit, as well as do some pilot training there. That training would draw the attention of the pre-flight schools and North Carolina pre-flight, who managed to get him to finish his training in North Carolina and play for the football team. And good thing that Graham would come to North Carolina pre-flight, because he came in handy in this first game versus Navy, as Graham would throw the game-winning pass to Aschenbrenner to give North Carolina pre-flight the shocking 21-14 win. I'll get more into them in a moment, but Navy would rebound off that loss with a big win over Penn State and then a tough 7-0 win over Duke, and they would get back into being ranked in the top 10, as they were ranked number 9. After that ranking, they would go to Atlanta to play Georgia Tech, who were a part of the now full SEC. As I mentioned, the SEC had only 4 teams in 1943, including Georgia Tech, and Georgia Tech would be coming back, as well as a dozen or so other teams from the SEC. And Georgia Tech would also be inviting a whole bunch of new players, as they would be able to reload due to being a V12 school, as well as a few other SEC schools were able to do as well. So that's why they managed to stay afloat this year. Getting those new V12 players really helped Georgia Tech in this game versus Navy. It seemed like Navy had a lot of trouble against service teams or teams that were in the V12 program because it would be a back and forth game, with Georgia Tech having a 7-6 lead at half and then a 14-13 lead going into the fourth quarter. Just after the quarter started, Navy would pin Georgia back and manage to get a safety to take a 15-14 lead. But Georgia Tech was not willing to lose like that and would go all the way down to the Navy 9 and kick the game-winning field goal to win 17-15. So now Navy would have 2 close losses in their first 4 games, which was something no one foresaw, but they would be able to rebound quickly as they traveled to Philadelphia to play Penn and dismantle them 26-0 to put them back at a winning record at 3-2 and back up into the top 10 rankings, as they were now at number 6 before they got ready for a big game versus Notre Dame. Finally, Notre Dame, who I explained about the turnover they had at coach and players, but due to them still being a V12 school, they could still get the best of the Midwest. And that would show itself as Notre Dame started with 3 straight shutouts over Pitt, Tulane, and Dartmouth to start their season, and they would score over 35 points per game. They had their first test versus Wisconsin. Even though Wisconsin would score on them, the game wasn't really in doubt, as Notre Dame was better than them, and they would end up winning 28-13 to be 4-0 now. Their 5th game was versus Illinois, who had 1 loss and 1 tie, and it would also be an interesting game because Illinois had a fantastic defense who managed to compete with Notre Dame, as they only allowed Notre Dame to score 13 points, but they couldn't score any more than a touchdown, so Notre Dame would win again, 13-7. Going into November now, the AP poll would have Army take over the number 1 spot from Notre Dame, who fell to number 2. November 4th was a big weekend for this season with 2 big games. First, Ohio State would play Indiana, and after a slow start and a Horvath score, Ohio State would manage to get past Indiana 21-7 to give them another big win. Meanwhile, the first top 5 matchup of the season would be in Baltimore between Navy and Notre Dame. Even though Navy had 2 losses, they were favored in this game over the undefeated Notre Dame squad, which seems pretty incredible, but this game went a lot like last year, as Notre Dame couldn't get past a Navy squad, and they lost 32-13 and really weren't in it from the get-go. The loss would send Notre Dame out of the number 2 spot, but only down to number 5, as Ohio State would move up to number 2, with Navy at number 3 now. And again, Navy had 2 losses, but they just scored that big win there. Army, of course, would stay at number 1 after a huge 83-0 win over Villanova, in which Glenn Davis would score 3 touchdowns before the half, and they even had to shorten the second half due to it being 62-0 at halftime. And speaking of Army, they would have their first real test of the season, as they would go and play Notre Dame. This time, though, it would happen at Yankee Stadium, because like I mentioned, Army pretty much never left the state of New York. Army would, however, be without Doc Blanchard in this game, as he was injured, but it didn't matter, as Army scored 3 touchdowns before the first quarter was over, and the scoring didn't stop, as Army's awesome offense this year would score 59 points on Notre Dame, and Notre Dame couldn't get a thing on them, as Notre Dame was shut out. This loss was the worst loss for Notre Dame ever up to this point, and it solidified Army as the top team again in the new poll. This might be, though, one of the strangest AP polls in history, as the top 3 spots were taken over by military teams, as Army was number 1, Randolph Field was number 2, who were still undefeated, Navy, who had 2 losses, remember, were number 3, Ohio State, who were still undefeated, was number 4, and this was even after a big win that Ohio State had over Pitt this weekend, but they still couldn't jump any of these Army, Navy, or service teams. Ohio State, though, would be able to gain in the AP poll next week when they would beat Illinois 26-12. Michigan would also win over Wisconsin, making the next week's matchup between Michigan and Ohio State for not only bragging rights, but for the Big 9 title. Meanwhile, Navy won again by shutout as they beat Cornell the previous week, and then this week they would crush Purdue 32-0. Army would make sure they didn't have a lull after a big win as they continued to destroy opponents, as this time they beat Penn in Philadelphia, 62-7. This was one of the few games where Army actually had to leave New York. Army now were 8-0 and had beaten their opponents by an average score of 60-4. Army and Navy would both have the final week of November off as they prepared for what would be the national title game on December 2nd. I say that even though the national title claim was questioned a bit by Ohio State as they played the one-loss Michigan team for the Big Nine title the last weekend of November. And this game would be seen by over 71,000 people, and it was a crazy game as there were 5 lead changes, and Ohio State was not able to pass the ball at all. They didn't complete any passes in this game, but were still able to use Horvath to win, as he scored twice, including the game-winning touchdown, after a shorter than usual field because Michigan's kickoff was flubbed a bit. The final score was 18-14, and it would give Ohio State what they thought was the national title. After the win, the Buckeyes were invited to play in the Rose Bowl, and Ohio State would actually ask the Big Nine Conference to lift that bowl ban, but the conference said no, so they would end their season 9-0, but not with the national title. I say that because the AP poll would come out after this game and put Ohio State at number 3. Army was number 1, and 2-loss Navy was number 2. So now with no other games left for Ohio State, they would have to watch and wait another week and hope that maybe Navy would win next week and pollsters would move Ohio State up, even though that was a stretch. And the next week's game was the annual Army-Navy game, and it was even bigger since it was 1 versus 2, which was the first time for this distinction for this game as well. And I wanted to mention that again because this game was a huge game. Everyone wanted to go. It would happen in Baltimore, and only people who lived within 10 miles of Baltimore and who purchased war bonds were able to procure tickets for this game. That's how hard it was to get tickets and how much people wanted to go to this. But even due to these restrictions, the game would raise $58.6 million, a staggering figure even by today's standards, as there were 66,000 people in attendance and millions of people listening on the radio all over the world. Douglas MacArthur would also later state that the war stopped for this game, and it would be a hard-fought game, and Army took control early as they knocked out Navy's 2 All-American picks in their back Bob Jenkins and their guard and captain Ben Chase. But even with the injuries, Navy kept it close as it was only 7-0 at half. After half, Navy got to within 2 points, but then Glenn Davis intercepted a pass that led to a touchdown, and then Blanchard scored another one to give Army the 23-7 win. This was Army's worst game of the season as they were actually outgained by almost 100 yards. But the biggest difference was that Army intercepted Navy 5 times. The game showed just how good Army was too, and just how good Navy was, as they were so close to beating Army even with the 5 interceptions. After the game, the AP poll would name Army the national champion and also consider them to be one of the best teams of all time. But after the poll was released, there were some more games, and it would be a postseason game with one of the best service teams playing a 2-game parlay across the country in a week. I talked a little bit about them. That would be Randolph Field. They would actually play 2 games late in December. They were fundraiser games, and I go over them in my exclusive Patreon all about service teams that were in bowl games, patreon.com/wrongsports. Link also in the description below. And that is why I'm not going to go into other bowl games. Army and Navy weren't in them, so Dame wasn't in them either, so that's really why I'm not going to mention them too much. And of course, tell me what you think in the comments below. Who do you think should have won? Even though it's hard to argue that Army was not the best team this year, they pretty much were. They destroyed Notre Dame and Navy, and those were the other 2 best teams that year. I guess they could have played Ohio State. That would have been a fun game. But otherwise, tell me what you think in the comments below. As always, make sure you subscribe to the channel, ring that bell so you can get updates, and make sure you like and share this video, share this channel with other college sports fans.